Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe now to get the latest ancient history news and independent research from around the world. A little over a year ago, I made the first video in this two-part series that looked at the face of the Great Sphinx and who exactly we are looking at. I didn't make the second part straight away because, in all honesty, I was unsure. I found it hard to make a conclusion because my knowledge on the history of Giza, the Sphinx and the pyramids was still lacking. I needed to do more background research to offer my opinion, an opinion that I can stand behind and that is backed up with clear evidence and thought processes. I would urge you to watch part 1, which I've linked below in the description, because it explains why I don't think the face is anybody from the 18th dynasty. Not Pharaoh Thutmose IV, not Horemakhet II, and so on. The reason for this is simple. In the New Kingdom, the Sphinx was called Horemakhet, and that means Horus of the Horizon, and it was a monument dedicated to the god known as Ra-Horakhty, a composite god of Ra, the main sun god, and Horakhty, meaning Horus of the two horizons. The name together means Ra as Horus of the two horizons. By all accounts, the Sphinx was viewed as a statue of this supreme solar deity. Sphinx statues and engravings were created by and during the reigns of every 18th dynasty king, from Ahmose I to Akhenaten and so on, continuing throughout the New Kingdom. In art, the Sphinx was portrayed with a lion body in a human head, and was always identified with the names Horemakhet and Ra-Horakhty in associated text, notably seen on 18th dynasty votive stelae. In Egyptian art, Horakhty was also portrayed as a hawk-headed sphinx, as a simple hawk, and also as a humanoid figure with a hawk's head, often with the sun disk on top. The latter is usually a representation of the composite god Ra-Horakhty, who is most often portrayed as a winged solar disk. I once thought that the head of the Sphinx, which is clearly out of proportion to the body, was recarved by Thutmose IV, the man who created the Dream Stela that sits between the paws of the monument. But as I soon found out, there are images of the Sphinx with a lion body and human pharaonic head in the Sphinx temple of Horemakhet II, who was the father of Thutmose IV. Therefore, the form of the Sphinx as we know it must predate Thutmose IV. The first mention of the personal name of the Sphinx, Horemakhet, was also made in the reign of Thutmose I, who reigned on the throne of Egypt nearly 100 years before Thutmose IV. Furthermore, as stated, in the New Kingdom, Sphinx statues with a pharaonic head and lion body go as far back as the first king Ahmose I. In fact, they even go back to his mother Ra-Horakhty. So, what is clear is that during the New Kingdom, the Sphinx already had the form of a human head and lion body. The 18th dynasty kings did restore the statue, we know that, and Thutmose IV also added a new beard. Howard Weiss and Giovanni Caviglia discovered fragments of this beard in the 19th century, and they discovered that this beard had a curvy tip, which identifies the wearer as a god. So, what this confirms is what we already know, that the 18th dynasty kings worshipped the Sphinx as a god, not as a representation of any specific pharaoh, and so it is highly unlikely that a New Kingdom king added his or her own face. They called the Sphinx Horemakhet, and it represented the god Ra-Horakhty, a god who was first mentioned way back in the Old Kingdom pyramid texts. The pyramid texts refer to Horakhty and Ra separately, but some attributes are closely related. At some point in the Old Kingdom, these two gods merged together. Horakhty was the god of the eastern horizon, and of course the Sphinx looks out facing due east. The old belief was that the deceased king of Egypt will be reborn in the eastern sky as Horakhty, so the orientation of the Sphinx does make sense. In the pyramid text, it says, "The two reed floats of the sky are laid down for Ra, that he may cross to the horizon. The two reed floats of the sky are laid down for Horakhty, that Horakhty may cross on them to Ra. The two reed floats of the sky are laid down for King Unas, that he may cross on them to Horakhty to Ra." And this passage may be showing us the merging of the two gods, Ra and Horemakhet, and it also helps us to identify the face of the Sphinx. In the Old Kingdom pre-5th Dynasty, the king of Egypt would become Horemakhet after death. In life, the king was human and a god all at once, embodied in the falcon deity Horus. In death, he became Horemakhet, Horus of the two horizons. In the early 4th Dynasty, Ra wasn't a prominent god, and it wasn't until Khufu's son, Djedefre, came to power that the kings became known as sons of Ra. Ra grew in prominence from then on, especially during the 5th Dynasty, when Ra's cult centre at Heliopolis grew. When Horemakhet was accepted into the Ennead of gods at Heliopolis, he was merged with Ra, and this god became known as Ra-Horakhty. With the merging of Ra and Horemakhet, kings of Egypt were considered to be sons of Ra-Horakhty. As shown so blatantly by Akhenaten in the 18th dynasty, Ra-Horakhty was the father, the Pharaoh was the son. In the Amarna period, the Aten sun disk represented the father in the same way that the Sphinx represented the same god. For example, Akhenaten referred to the father god as "Long live Ra-Horakhty, he who rejoices in the horizon in his name, as the sunlight which is Aten." So, what this tells us is that a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty could not carve his or her own face onto a statue of Ra-Horakhty. It would be sacrilegious. Yes, pharaohs did repurpose statues of previous pharaohs, putting their own face onto them, but they would not carve their own faces onto a statue of a god. And that is exactly how they viewed the statue of the Sphinx, a statue of the father god, the powerful Ra-Horakhty. Saying that and the face of an Old Kingdom king, pre-5th dynasty, could have been used on a statue of Horemakhet, before Ra and Horemakhet became merged, because the people in the early dynasties believed that the king would become Horemakhet after death. As the 5th dynasty pyramid texts show, Unas was crossing the sky to Horemakhet to Ra. Before the 5th dynasty, kings would be reborn in the sky as Horemakhet. There is a difference. I know all of this is quite confusing, so I'll recap some key points now. What we know is as follows. Point 1. The New or possibly Middle Kingdom Egyptians gave the Sphinx the personal name of Horemakhet, which was a representation of the great god Ra-Horakhty. On numerous stelae from the 18th dynasty, the Sphinx is called both Horemakhet and Ra-Horakhty, and sometimes just Horemakhet. Number 2. Thutmose IV knew the Sphinx as Horemakhet, a representation of Ra-Horakhty, and he also gave the beard of the Sphinx a curvy tip, indicative of a god. He viewed the Sphinx as a god. Point 3. From the art of the New Kingdom, we know that the Great Sphinx had the form of a lion body and human head from before the first reign of the first king, Ahmose I. For example, we see human-headed sphinxes depicted on the armlets of Ahmose's mother, the Great Queen Ahotep. Point 4. The New Kingdom pharaohs called themselves sons of Ra-Horakhty. They were not equivalents. They were not Ra-Horakhty personified. Number 5. The New Kingdom kings would not have defaced a statue of this god with their own likeness, because it would have been sacrilegious to do so. Point 6. Horemakhet dates back to at least the Old Kingdom, and was also mentioned in the pyramid texts. Point number 7. In the Old Kingdom before the 5th dynasty, it was believed the king of Egypt would become Horemakhet after death. And finally, point 8. The face of Horemakhet, the Sphinx statue representing Ra-Horakhty, must be that of a king before the 5th dynasty, before Horemakhet merged with the supreme god Ra. As you can see, I'm trying to go through this methodically and rationally, without any bias whatsoever, and I hope I haven't made any glaring errors to this point, but now things do get a little more interesting. I think I can safely assume that this iconic statue of Horemakhet was given the head of a king from the Old Kingdom, because these Old Kingdom kings were believed to become this god on death. And this was before Horemakhet was merged together with Ra, something which may well have took place during the reign of Djedefre, Khufu's son. Before that time, the king would be reborn as Horemakhet in the eastern sky, and it's surely no coincidence that the Sphinx looks out towards the east. The Sphinx is a statue of an Old Kingdom king, a statue of the king looking out to the place he'll be reborn as Horemakhet. So, if the Sphinx is an Old Kingdom king, there are three, well, logically two possibilities for who we are looking at: Khufu or Khafre. Now, before people comment and say the Sphinx predates the Old Kingdom and that the pyramids are all pre-dynastic, well, maybe they are and maybe they're not. But that discussion is not relevant for this video. Because whether or not Khufu built the Great Pyramid, it is without question that this king is associated with it. And why? Well, apart from the Khufu graffiti inside the pyramid, which of course many debate, Khufu's eldest son, brother, vizier, mother, and all of his most loyal officials are buried around the Great Pyramid. Herodotus also calls the Great Pyramid his tomb, and in excavations from the 20th century, Khufu's name, his image and words, as well as pictures relating to his life and broken Khufu statues, were found all along the now lost Great Pyramid causeway. Furthermore, we have the Khufu boats inside pits that are situated along the edge of the Great Pyramid, and we know that these were dug by his son and successor Djedefre, as shown by these cartouches. Khufu was associated with the Great Pyramid without question, whether he built it or not. If you watched a recent series of videos on this channel, you'll also see the evidence I put forward to state that Khufu is likely buried beneath the Great Pyramid, in a still undiscovered chamber which is likely to be even deeper than the subterranean chamber, and accessed from the old Giza canal system through the edge of the plateau, as shown here. So, that's Khufu in a nutshell, and Khafre is linked to Giza through similar archaeological discoveries as well. His name is found on objects in the workers' village located south of the Sphinx. His statues were also found in the Valley Temple at the end of his causeway, and his family and officials are also buried on the Giza Plateau. And no, there were no specific Khafre-related finds inside the second pyramid, but whether or not he was responsible for its construction, he was certainly associated with it. It's the same for Menkaure and the third pyramid. Now, Egyptologists associate the creation of the Sphinx with Khafre. The reasons are because it sits very close to the Khafre Valley Temple, it's right next to the Khafre Pyramid Causeway, and when you look from the front of the Sphinx, you can see the Khafre Pyramid directly behind it. Today, when you approach Giza from Cairo, you are greeted by the face of the Sphinx, and you can see the majestic Khafre Pyramid behind. So I can totally see why Khafre and the Sphinx would be linked, especially as Thutmose IV also mentions Khaf, most likely a reference to Khafre on the Dream Stela. But in Old Kingdom times, people would have not have travelled to Giza from Cairo, they would have come from Memphis in the south, and this is how they would see the Sphinx on arriving at the plateau. What we see is the profile view of the Great Sphinx, and we know from ancient Egyptian art how the Egyptians like to view things in profile. On temple causeways that are lined with sphinxes, the statues are always facing the causeway, and that is so you can see them in profile on your approach. So again, this is how people would view the Great Sphinx when travelling from the old capital of Memphis. And what is the structure directly behind, which looks almost like it is resting on the Sphinx's back? The Great Pyramid of Khufu. The Sphinx must be part of the original necropolis blueprint associated with Khufu, who I believe is entombed beneath the Great Pyramid just as Herodotus states. This is the view that people saw when visiting Akhet Khufu, to pay their respects to the king who was now deceased. They would see a representation of Khufu reborn as Horemakhet, aka the Sphinx, and they would then see the towering tomb of Khufu behind. But according to Egyptologists, in the days of Khufu it looked more like this, and according to some, it may have looked something like this. As stated, I'm not concerning myself with the age of the Great Pyramid or the age of the Sphinx in this video. I'm just logically trying to work out whose face we are looking at. And, in my opinion, the most likely candidate is Khufu, and it could have been carved by order of the king himself, or possibly by his son and successor Djedefre. As the next king, Djedefre would have played a major part in his father's funerary rites and rituals, and from the cartouches and hieroglyphs, we know that he was responsible for creating the boat pit that housed his father's funerary boat. It is possible that Djedefre carved his father's face onto the Sphinx. With his father's death and looming rebirth on the eastern horizon as Horemakhet, a statue of his father as Horemakhet looking out to the eastern horizon does make total sense. Interestingly, it is during the reign of Djedefre when we first see what some believe is the first Sphinx statue ever created, where what looks like an older statue of a recumbent lion has had its head recarved to show the face of Djedefre's wife, Hetepheres II. This statue was found at the Abu Ruash pyramid, which is thought to have been built by Djedefre. After getting this far into the script for this video, I discovered that this idea that Djedefre carved the Sphinx to the likeness of his father and predecessor Khufu was actually first put forward by Egyptologist Vasil Dobrev, a claim that made the news back in 2004. As stated, Djedefre was the first king of Egypt to add the title Son of Ra to his birth name, and it is during his reign that the solar cult grew in power, and as we know the Sphinx is a solar monument looking east to the rising sun. It is likely that it was during Djedefre's reign when Horemakhet was merged with Ra. Djedefre was the son of Khufu, which now means he is the son of Horemakhet, the deceased Khufu, and he also identified himself as the son of Ra. So, merging Ra and Horemakhet makes sense. Ra-Horakhty is the father of Djedefre, and Ra-Horakhty was certainly viewed as the supreme father god much later in the New Kingdom, being the head of Akhenaten's semi-monotheistic religion. Therefore, the Sphinx could well be the first statue ever made of the new composite god Ra-Horakhty using the face of Khufu. I would also guess that a solar disc once sat on its head, and we know the Sphinx does have a hole in the top of its head. The other option is that Khufu placed his own face on the Sphinx, and this could have been part of the original plans for his necropolis, meaning his face on a statue of Horemakhet was his idea. This is backed up by the inventory Stela, a document found at Giza but dating to the 26th dynasty. It is therefore much later than the Old and even the New Kingdoms, although it is thought by some to be a copy of an earlier document. The document states that Khufu restored the Sphinx, which indicates there was already a monument there, and implies that Khufu could have recarved the head. It's funny because Egyptologists call the inventory Stela a fraud, and its claims about Khufu and the Sphinx as false, and this is all because it comes from the 26th dynasty, around 2000 years after the 4th dynasty. Yet, many scholars are happy to accept that Khafre on the Dream Stela, a document that was made around 1000 years after the reign of Khafre, is enough evidence to attribute the carving of the Sphinx to this Old Kingdom king. 1000 years is a huge amount of time. All of the other Sphinx Khafre evidence is circumstantial, because even the Khafre causeway that sits beside the Sphinx was likely a ramp that was used in the construction of the Great Pyramid, to transport stone from the harbour in front of the Sphinx to the higher ground in the west. This was a theory proposed by the brilliant Jean-Pierre Houdin. If it's true, and I think it's very possible, then it means that this part of Giza was very much in use long before Khafre came to power. Maybe we are looking at Khafre's face on the Sphinx, but looking at the evidence, I think it has to be that of Khufu, unless of course the face was recarved again in the later stages of Egyptian history, maybe even by the Greeks or the Romans. We just don't know. But if I was a betting man, I'd say that the face carved onto the Sphinx is that of the elusive King Khufu, carved by order of the king himself, or maybe by his son Djedefre. Before the head of Khufu was carved, the Sphinx was likely a guardian acre lion, a lion that guarded the realm of Sokar known as Rostau in Egyptian texts, and we know that an old name for Giza was also Rostau. Please see this video on the origins of Giza that I made a few months ago for more details. I'm guessing that the Sphinx statue and the entire Giza plateau was reworked and transformed into a 4th dynasty necropolis. The Great Pyramid was either built, enlarged or was reclad, with Khufu buried beneath it, and the Sphinx head was likely reworked to become a statue of the deceased king in his new guise as Horemakhet, a king who would be reborn on the eastern horizon as a god. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this video, so please do comment below. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.